This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Thanks for downloading the In Our Time podcast. For more details about In Our Time and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello. Tennyson wrote, "A cracking and a riving of the roofs, and rending and a blast, and overhead thunder, and in the thunder was a cry. And in the blast there smote along the hall a beam of light 7 times more clear than day, and down the long beam stole the Holy Grail." The dread allure of the Holy Grail has fascinated writers and ensnared knights about 1,000 years ago, and it goes on, from Malory to Monty Python. It has one of the richest associations of any artefact in British myth. But where does it spring from? What does it symbolise? And why are its stories so resolutely set in these islands and so often written by the French? With me on this quest for the truth behind the Holy Grail are Caroline Larrington, tutor in medieval English at St John's College, Oxford, Jonathan Riley-Smith, Dixie Professor of Ecclesiastical History at Cambridge University, and Juliet Wood, Associate Lecturer in the Department of Welsh at Cardiff University. Caroline Larrington, the Grail first appears in medieval literature when Chrétien de Troyes writes his romance Perceval in the 1180s. Can you outline that story for us?
Fundamentally, what happens in Chrétien is that Perceval, who's a knight who's had little education, little formal training, he's been brought up rather removed from knightly society by his mother, who doesn't want him to become a knight, has arrived at the court and is involved in really quite a different adventure when he stumbles across a castle next to a lake. And on the lake there are 2 fishers who point him in the direction of the castle. So he goes off to spend the night at the castle, and while he's there, he's welcomed very warmly, and he sees a curious procession in the hall at dinner time. Some maidens pass through the hall carrying a candelabra, a sword, a spear, and, importantly for what's going to develop, a large flat serving dish, which is called a graal. And this is really quite an ordinary dish. It doesn't have any particular meaning as far as the word is concerned. Now, Perceval has been warned by his uncle not to ask foolish questions. And so although he's deeply curious about what this procession means, he knows better, he thinks, than to ask any questions about where the procession is going, because it passes through the hall and disappears into a side room. But he resolves the next morning on his way out of the castle to ask quietly and discreetly what was going on. But when he wakes up the next morning, the castle is empty. Nobody is there. He gets his horse and he rides off into the forest, where he meets a maiden who turns out, in fact, to be his cousin. And she's astonished to learn that he's come from the Grail Castle, and asks him with mounting excitement whether he asked the question. And the question which he should have asked is, whom does the Grail serve? And Perceval has to admit in a rather shamefaced way that he never really got round to asking the question. And his cousin curses him, and Perceval goes sorrowfully off on his way, resolving to get back to the Grail Castle, but of course it's not so easy. And in fact, in Chrétien's version, the story is incomplete, so we never actually see Perceval get back.
So we have the Graal there, which isn't quite the Grail. We have the bleeding spear, the candelabra, and we also have Jonathan Riley-Smith, the 2 fishermen by the lake who point him to the way. One of them turns out to be the Fisher King, and that's invented at a time, 1180s, Chrétien is writing this, when the Crusades weren't going so well. The Crusaders had taken Jerusalem in 1099, and they lost it, about to lose it in 1187. Is there any connection between the Fisher King figure there and the Crusades?
I don't actually think there is a direct connection. I mean, there is obviously a very strong connection, indirectly, between the idea which lies behind Chrétien de Troyes, and of course is developed later, of a relic, and particularly a relic of the Passion, or right at the beginning of the Passion, the Last Supper, although even that's a bit dubious, given the way that the Grail takes all sorts of curious forms, including that of a stone. But there's obviously a link between that and the holding of Jerusalem, the enormous number of pilgrimages to Jerusalem in the 12th century, the place that relics of the Passion had in the 12th century. And beyond all that, of course, given that we are dealing here with quest literature, which of course is as old as mankind, and particularly the simpleton or the innocent on a quest is just, must be from very, very primitive times, given that what was obsessing these people was what had turned out to be the greatest collective quest of all, which was the First Crusade.
Can I ask you whether knights like Perceval, who were roaming the country, as it were, to do good, errant knights, were could have been said to have been based on 12th century knights at that time, real knights, if we put it that way, in history? You have spoken of the breeding habits of the lesser French nobility in this respect.
Yes, I mean, I think there is an element of transference that may be going on here. I mean, we are all involved in guesswork.
Well, less than me, I know.
But the fact is that if you look at the French middle-ranking and lower nobility for most of the 12th century, the situation of most of the young men born into that class was extremely uncomfortable, because what happened was that in any family, one son was chosen as the breeder and was allowed to marry. So
was he always the oldest, or was it the sort of fittest?
No.
Was it Darwinian or age?
It was Darwinian. I mean, it was very often the eldest, but it wasn't necessarily the eldest. Right. One was chosen as a breeder because, of course, you wanted to hold the estate together. You didn't want to divide it among sons. So one was chosen as a breeder, and the others weren't necessarily sent into the church. They were just supposed to hang around and make themselves useful. Now, what you got then in the kind of atmosphere of frustration was young men making themselves off. They had no chance of marriage in their own district, so travelling as far away as they could in the hope of catching the eye of some heiress. Now, that is knight-errantry. But it is a knight-errantry... It is a knight-errantry which is born of sexual frustration. And in a sense, of course, insofar as it is influencing quest literature, what is happening is this is being transferred into a kind of search for purity by the innocent, rather than a search for a wife by people who are sort of throbbing with desire.
I think we can move to Juliet Wood on that note. The next stage in the writing of this is, after Chrétien, is German. Wolfram von Eschenbach in 1200, he writes Parsifal, which Wagner based his opera upon. It also tells the story of a knight and a fisher king and a grail. How does it differ from Chrétien's, briefly? And who were those stories written for?
Wolfram's stories, like Chrétien's, would have been written for an elite. This is not popular literature, and this is not folk literature. This is definitely very, very self-conscious literature, written for a particular, very small group of people who would have shared broadly the same lifestyle. With Wolfram, Arthur is actually even less important. Wolfram, and indeed the whole of the German tradition, Arthur is less important. I suppose it was that bit farther away from Britain, basically. And Parzival has an extraordinary complicated thing. I won't even try to summarise all of it. But Parzival is more than ever linked with Gawain. So you get this idea of Parzival as being the spiritual knight, the knight who finds the Grail and embodies all of chivalry. And Gawain, much more the kind of knight that Jonathan was talking about, as the knight of the worldly chivalry. And he's the ladies' man. I mean, he's a womanizer, is Gawain, except in the English tradition. He is really always after the girls. Then, of course, Wolfram also adds a third character, a pagan, piebald half-brother, half-Saracen brother of Parzival. So you get the Crusades coming in, but coming in really not realistically, but really as an image. So Parzival is very, very aware of what you can do with the quest symbolism. Here's Percival the spiritual knight, Gawain the earthly knight, and this other third character dragged in as the kind of alien who's brought in. Now, Parzival is also much more complicated in terms of his relationship to the Grail, because his mother was a Grail guardian and his father was related to Arthur. So you get all of the Arthurian stuff and all of the Grail stuff in Parzival. And of course, Parzival knows none of this when it starts. The whole of the story, in Wolfram more than anybody else, is Parzival going through increasingly complex stories, increasingly complex adventures, where he begins to find out who he is.
Can you tell us just a little bit about the Fisher King at this stage? The Fisher King and his wound and why he's wounded.
The Fisher King is wounded in the leg or in the thigh. and he cannot walk, he limps. And in the early ones, he's kind of sitting in this boat fishing, literally, because this is the only thing he can do. He can't be knightly anymore. And particularly in Wolfram, it says very clearly it's a thigh wound. And Wolfram says that the Fisher King cannot die because the Grail keeps him alive. So the Fisher King is waiting for his successor. He's waiting for the young man to take him over. Now, it's kind of, one has to jump ahead to understand what the Fisher King isn't. Modern thinking tries to make the Fisher King castrated, but there's really nothing of that in the tales. You have a knight who cannot be a knight any longer, waiting for the young man, for his successor to take over it. And this would have resonated beautifully in the Middle Ages, where you had to have an active heir in order to keep your estates together.
Did Chrétien de Troyes and therefore Eschenbach take their stories of King Arthur from Geoffrey of Monmouth in his History of Kings in 1138? Double question, sorry, and does it also go back to Celtic sources, which we haven't yet talked about?
That's one of the main sources for the Grail. Now, Geoffrey doesn't actually mention the Grail. Geoffrey's Arthur is, well, he's a bit of a thug, actually. He's very, very aggressive. But there is one point in Geoffrey where there's a break between the fighting. And Geoffrey says, and the best men in the world came to Arthur. And that's the world of the romances. Now, one of the main sources for this must be Celtic stories, because the matter of Britain included all of the stories of what we now call the Celts. And one of the important elements there is a search by heroes.
These recorded in the Mabinogion?
These are recorded in the Mabinogion, mainly elsewhere, but principally in the Mabinogion, and to some extent in Irish as well. And these have a hero who goes off searching for an otherworld talisman. It's specifically an otherworld object. And sometimes this object is actually a cauldron, which is why the Grail comes in. A cauldron
which will feed everyone with what they want all the time.
It's a cauldron of plenty. It's a cauldron of plenty.
Jonathan Ryder-Smith, before we come to the next person who wrote about it, Robert de Boron, is there any sense of these Grail stories beginning to come together? We have a cauldron, we have a Graal, a plate, we have, as you mentioned, we have a stone, and there are other things coming up as to what the Grail is. How closely do you see this now being associated with the relics coming back from Jerusalem? Do you think that is much the most powerful force in the idea of the Grail, the quest, these knights, these wounds, and so on? Is the crusade? Are the Crusades giving it the energy that it has?
Well, anyone at the time listening to one of these stories, I mean, it wouldn't matter what story, actually, of all the early ones, or what form, would have recognised a common denominator in all the forms that the Grail takes. And that is what in Latin is called virtus, which is power. Now, that power was associated at the time particularly with relics. That is, a holy person, and particularly, of course, Christ, but a holy person had a kind of intrinsic power which was taken over by whatever relic we were concerned with. It could be, in fact, a bit of clothing, not necessarily a piece of body. And so anyone hearing one of these stories would have once have thought of a relic. We are at the moment in a period in which veneration of relics, and particularly the relics of passion, are heightening, and the great climax is to come, by which time, of course, the Grail legends have become mature.
The Grail is not part of is not one of the relics of the Passion that is collected. The Grail is absent. You get the cross, you get the crown, you get the Lance of Longinus, but there are no medieval relics that claim to be the Grail.
Just a sec. The one thing that isn't fitting in yet, then we can discuss a bit more generally. We haven't got to Joseph of Arimathea, and he turns up in the account by Robert de Boron, written again by a Frenchman in France in 1200. Can you briefly, Caroline, tell us where Joseph of Arimathea fits into the Grail story?
Well, Joseph of Arimathea is, of course, an attested gospel figure. He's the one who provides the sepulchre for Christ. And Robert de Boron seems to have made use of the apocryphal Gospels, the Gospels which weren't accepted in the Bible, to put together a story in which Joseph, really while Christ is hanging on the cross, realises the importance of Christ, goes around to the upper room where the Last Supper took place and finds the dish that was used both for the serving of the Paschal lamb, which also seems to serve as a cup. Then he returns to Calvary and takes down Christ's body, takes it to the sepulchre to bury it, and collects some of the blood that's dripping from Christ's wounds at that point into this dish. Thereafter, things become rather complicated. He's imprisoned, he's fed by the dish, the magical food source, as it's now become. He's eventually released from prison. He goes to a neighbouring city of Sarras with his son Josephus, who becomes the first bishop. And they collect a king. They convert and then collect a king from that city. And they all head off to Britain, carrying the Grail, in order to convert Britain to Christianity and to bring this sacred relic to British soil. And this is the beginning of a line of Grail-keeping kings, the last of whom appears in the Quest of the Holy Grail in the form that we know it in English and in French. And the Grail has a sort of intermittent appearance. It lives with the Grail keeper, but it sometimes appears elsewhere, as in Camelot at the beginning of the Grail quest. And another important feature here is the idea that the table of the Last Supper is reproduced by a second table, the table of the Holy Grail, where the Grail in effect sort of lives when it's not out and about. And the third table is the Round Table. So the Round Table, constructed by Merlin for Arthur's court, is supposed to reflect these previous tables and make a sort of fundamental link between the worldly chivalry of Arthur's court and this preceding type of chivalry.
What is all? There's quite enough in place now, as it were. So what's this telling us about the society? You say it's top down, Juliet, that it's not folklore and so on. Jonathan's talked a little about the knights and a great deal about the sort of relics and so on. Can we just discuss what is this saying to the society which it's addressing? Are these teaching things? Are they this is how you should behave? Are they describing society in a profound way? What's it saying about the obviously people of great intelligence? How seriously are they taking them to start with?
It's teaching through narrative.
Yeah.
And narratives are extremely powerful. And I think primarily the narratives were enjoyed for themselves, for their own sake. They liked the narratives and they
Just
liked
enjoyed
all
the stories.
They simply enjoyed the stories.
So then that's you're saying they're regarded as entertainment,
Absolutely.
full stop. So
Absolutely.
they didn't have much significance.
But entertainment was never entertainment, full stop. And this is where this idea of their own sense of chivalry, their own sense of the complexity of chivalry, their own sense of virtus, their own sense of what it meant to be good. You were not just a brave knight, you had to be a good knight as well. So you have these stories which are wonderful in and of themselves, and they're universal and timeless stories. But for them, they also had a particular meaning.
Jonathan, you said there's never been such a century for guilt.
Have elsewhere, yes.
Yes, you have elsewhere said that, yes. Now, what, and you've given us some terrible examples. I mean, for instance, there's one vision that someone has of men climbing up a red-hot ladder,
yes,
and they fall back into a barrel of boiling pitch, and this is for sexual offences, but the sexual offences are making love to their wives on a Friday.
Oh, more than a Friday. It's the whole of Lent, the whole of Advent, the whole of a 40-day fasting period in the summer, certain saints' days, every Wednesday, every Friday, every Saturday.
And pregnancy and breastfeeding.
Yes, yes.
You couldn't fight on those days either.
In other words, without being silly about it, because this does lead to another important point you're making, it's far better to be a virgin.
Well, I think that, I mean, they were... The problem was they faced real choices, but in a sense the choices were not real. By that I mean you could go into the church, you could go into religious community, you could abandon the world and hope by doing that to achieve salvation. But that was irresponsible. If you were the head of a family, it was impossible to do. So a choice actually was not a real choice. One must understand that this is a world in which goals are set for married men, for knights, for whatever. And these goals are very rarely achievable. And people understood that. The point you always made about the age of faith and this feeling of guilt is that the difference between then and now is they achieved their goals no more than we did. In fact, they behaved many often a great deal worse than we did. But they worried about it, and that was the difference. They worried about not achieving the goals, even though they knew perfectly well that those goals would be very, very rarely achievable.
Is it at all surprising to Caroline that the idea of the Grail comes to reside in the British Isles and then fastens on Glastonbury and places like that. Although mostly written about by French historians.
Again, the connection with Glastonbury is a very late one. Although Joseph is very early connected with Glastonbury, the actual connection with the Grail being somehow hidden in Glastonbury is something that seems to come out of the 19th century tourist trade, in effect. But the idea that the Grail should come here originally, I think, is just part of a conversion story. It's part of a late origin myth for the British people, if you like. Where did Christianity come from? Not apparently from St. Augustine, but right from somebody who had held Christ in his arms and buried him, which makes for a more dramatic story, makes Britain more prominent in Christian culture.
Gives us something of a chosen people view of ourselves.
Yes, and of course most nations like to argue that they were particularly chosen in some way. And even now you begin to, evolving in the last century, is the idea, which is now promulgated again in the Glastonbury tourist trade, that Christ came to Glastonbury as a young man with Joseph.
And of course these were French historians, yes, but they were Norman French historians. And of course it was the Normans who ran Britain. So in the sense the Normans were creating an Anglo-Norman myth in which Britain was seen as central, because that's where the Normans were.
Because they needed their own myths, having cut themselves off from
France.
Jonathan?
Yes, the Glastonbury legend is actually itself about the time Chrétien de Troyes was writing. Of course, the body of Arthur was theoretically found at Glastonbury.
1191.
Yeah, and then in the most amazing ceremony in the later 13th century, King Edward I of England and his wife Eleanor presided over the translation of Arthur's body into a tomb right in the centre of the nave at Glastonbury. And this was quite an extraordinary sort of celebration of this Arthurian past. And what has always puzzled me, and no one's ever explained to me, is why a man like Henry VIII, who was so committed to, as it were, the nation's past.
Well, so committed to it that he vandalised most of it, yeah.
But destroyed Glastonbury.
Yeah.
You'd have thought of all
With
places he would have
there.
preserved it.
But I think this is because it was starting then to be part associated with things that were prior to the Reformation.
Julia, can I ask any of you, the Thomas Malory, Sir Thomas Malory, he of the imprisoned person who wrote Morte d'Arthur in 1469, does that mark the end of this, as it were, a romance of the Grail?
It marks the culmination of the medieval romance, because Malory is writing at a time and he recognised that his world was ending. He was writing during the War of the Roses, and the Tudor period was not a period of courtly, it was just different. And Malory was basing his sources really on a translation of the French Grail, a completely developed Grail, where this Grail quest had become both the quest that the knights most wanted to do and the way that the Arthurian world was going to unravel. And it was perfect for Malory, because Malory realised his world was unravelling. So it certainly represents the end of a medieval Grail. Now, you had another period, the Tudors were interested in it, until Henry VIII, where the whole thing, because of the Reformation, I think, the whole of this, the idea of the Grail and the whole of the quest disappears for a while, for a long while.
Sorry, can you talk about that, Caroline? Does the Grail idea just fade as the Reformation comes in, and if so, why?
I think it's certainly true that the kind of complications of Eucharistic belief after the Reformation meant that focusing on the Grail itself and the kind of questions of transubstantiation and so on, which were very much at issue in the Reformation, made it too dangerous, perhaps, really, to concern oneself with. But I wanted to go back to the point that Juliet was making about Malory. Malory is not actually, I think, terribly interested in the religious side of the Grail quest. His main interest is Lancelot and the knights who fail. And he makes it very clear that Gawain, for example, gets absolutely nowhere in the quest because when he's rebuked by a hermit for going around and killing people and behaving in a worldly way, he says, well, that's what knights do. I'm sorry, I have to go. And Lancelot gets to the Grail Castle and almost makes it, almost gets to the inner sanctum, but is pushed back by a kind of divine force field and falls into a coma. And I think Malory is much more interested in the political implications, in a sense. Arthur is absolutely dead set against the Grail quest. It's very much emphasised in Malory. It will mean the destruction of the Round Table. And indeed, when the knights straggle back from the quest, nothing is ever the same again. It's the beginning of the end for the Round Table.
That's fascinating. We
conflict
have time for a telling postscript, but it is just a postscript. This is, as you intimated earlier on, all this is revived in the 19th century. Southey translates Malory, as it were. Tennyson writes his epic poem, The Mabinogion, is retranslated. It all comes up again, and then we go on to T.H. White, we go on to Camlet. Why does the 19th century find itself so attracted to it, Jonathan?
Well, I think, first of all, of course, it's partly a reaction to the Enlightenment. I mean, there's a way in which these things simply go in cycles. So that the 17th century was a very romantic century, but in a different way. It's the 19th century which really sees a revival of an interest in not only sort of medieval buildings, but also medieval culture and everything related to that culture. But, as always, I mean, it's true of us as well, it takes what interests it and then transforms it into something which is a reflection of itself. Overwhelmingly, the 19th century sees the Middle Ages as a precursor of imperialism. And it sees medieval knighthood, the Crusades, and the rest of it is all setting out models for the imperial ventures, the new quests which it's involved in. And, of course, at the same time, it sees in the Middle Ages not only that imperial picture, but also a series of ideals which can soften the effects of the Industrial Revolution.
Juliet, what's your view?
It becomes the ideal quest which can never quite be achieved. And I think, again, this imperial world rather liked to think that it could achieve everything on a physical level, and therefore it had almost the kind of luxury of having this wonderful magical quest that they could afford not to quite win.
Do you think that, Jonathan, each of you briefly, do you think that the Grail has platted itself into our national mythology and sense of ourselves, or is it something that had its great moment for 150 years, had a bit of a revival, and now is petering out into show business?
Well, it's certainly now show business, there's no question about that. Well, I think quest literature will always be with us. And that always takes certain forms, including, as we've said, a sort of naive, innocent, a series of hurdles that are put in front of. And actually, the Grail story turns out in the end to be a jolly good one.
Julia?
Well, I think it's now become popular culture, where it was elite culture and sort of very controlled in the Middle Ages. It's now completely escaped.
So it's
and you can say everything. It's become
turning
folklore.
Into folklore.
It's become folklore, definitely.
So it's percolating down.
Absolutely. You get it across the internet, you get it through media. No, it's become much better known now than it ever was. And I think completely beyond anyone's control. I mean, it's become very much a kind of Grail, a receding ideal.
Because it speaks so much to the individual now, that the popular idea of the Grail quest is becoming what you can do, doing your best, achieving your dream. I think a very American sense of self-realisation. And it's undergone a great change in that respect, but it's changed to fit the ideals of the society, which is using it as a thing to think with.
Right, and it still has purchase.
Very much so.
Or we wouldn't be here.
Exactly.
Thank you all very much, Caroline Larrington, Juliet Wood and Jonathan Riley-Smith. Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed this Radio 4 podcast. You can find hundreds of other programmes about history, science and philosophy at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.